there are 10 must-have skills that every account executive should have. The question is, how many do you possess? Because I'm gonna tell you right now, I've been in the game for about 20 years, and the average AE, they only got about 3 or 4 of these mastered. And that's why they're average, and that's why their commission checks are looking very average as well. So let's look at what they are, and let's see if you got the skills required to be a top tier account executive. All right, and the first skill is all about people, because you are in sales after all, and that is the skill of networking. Have you ever heard the phrase, your net worth is determined by your network? Well, if you haven't heard it, you better get out under that rock, because how good of a networker you are is going to impact every single part of your career. Networking, it's not just the number of people you got following you on LinkedIn. It's about how many meaningful relationships do you have. It's about what are people saying about you when you're not in the room. Even worse, are they even talking about you? Because every single person in your network, they represent a potential opportunity. And I know that sounds very self-serving, but it's not, because you also got to be providing value to those in your network. And that's the key behind a relationship. So look at this scenario. We got 2 salespeople, let's call them Tom and Frank, and they're going head to head on a deal, mano y mano. Now, the customer looks up Tom and he's all over the Google search. And then he clicks on his LinkedIn and he sees that Tom is connected to all the industry experts. He knows common connections with the customer and he looks like a baller. Meanwhile, Frank, he's nowhere to be found. I gotta do some sleuthing to find this guy's LinkedIn profile. And then when he finally does, he sees Frank wearing a crumbly old shirt. He ain't connected to nobody and he's looking like a chump. Well, if the customer doesn't know Tom or Frank from Adam, who do you think they're gonna trust in this scenario? Well, chances are they're gonna trust Tom because he's gonna come across like he's just one of the homies. Meanwhile, Frank, he's just some random sales guy as far as they're concerned. So how do you become a baller like Tom? Well, it all starts with sliding in those DMs. And no, I ain't talking about the girl on Instagram that you're trying to holler at. You can do that on your own time because we're talking business right now. I'm talking about sliding in those LinkedIn DMs. Next time you get a connection, reach out to them. If you don't know the person, introduce yourself. If it's somebody that you do know, maybe like a former colleague, ask them how they're doing. But don't overthink this. All you gotta do is just be genuine, be curious. And that's how real relationships are formed. And my advice is don't go into these conversations with a bunch of self-serving intentions. Just be your genuine self and you're gonna be shocked how many things come out of that. Because your next big opportunity, it might just be one conversation or one introduction away. And this brings us to our next must-have skill, which is communication. You got to know how to talk, right? Think about communication as a two-way bridge between you and your clients. And this isn't just about talking and yapping and discussing the weather. No, this is a two-way conversation and you got 2 ears and 1 mouth. So use them accordingly, because if you don't know what the situation is with your client, if you don't understand them, then you probably got no business telling them your life story. And honestly, they probably don't want to hear it from you. And what listening does is it builds trust with your customers. I remember this one time back when I used to do demos as an SE before I was a manager. I had a customer and they were tripping about our Salesforce integration. And I thought I had nailed the demo. So instead of just word vomiting though and just spitting a bunch of technical jargon and showing them all the different features we have, I asked them, well, what are your concerns? And it turned out what they really cared about was reducing the amount of clicks. And they just didn't like how many times I had to click the different buttons in Salesforce. Well, very easy answer to that one. We could just make this a 1-button click and boom, it was that easy. But imagine if I had just word vomited and just said every little thing that was on my mind at that moment, I might have completely missed their objection. And I'll tell you right now, this is what the average salesperson does. They got diarrhea of the mouth. They don't listen to anything the customer says. They don't ask open-ended questions, and they just try to push their agenda onto the customer. But the problem with that is people don't care how much you know unless they know how much you care. And you gotta remember, effective communication, it's the basis of all relationships. And we talk about this in some of our other videos, but some techniques for effective communication include analogies, stories, and really simplifying down complex processes, which by the way, exist everywhere in tech. And that's where things like visuals or slides also come in handy. But what you're really trying to do is make the conversation easy. You're not trying to overcomplicate this for your customer, and you're trying to make it as relevant as possible to them. In fact, one of those things I just mentioned is actually one of our next must-have skills, and that's storytelling. All right, the goal of a story, it's not just to talk about this happened, then this happened, then this happened. No, the goal of a story, it's to evoke emotion. It's to create a connection, because when you do that, you're gonna hook your customers in and they're really gonna start listening to you. And the best part is, if you have a really well-told story, the customer, they're gonna be able to tell that story to somebody else. This is how we've been learning as a species for the last thousands and thousands and thousands of years, because there was a time where writing wasn't a thing and all we had was the stories that we told. All right, I'm gonna do something crazy here, and I'm gonna tell you guys a story about a story. So back when I was a brand new AE, I had a sales manager. I didn't really get along with him, but I heard him on a call one day and he got this objection. Why are you guys so much more expensive than your competitor? It's the exact same thing. And this dude dropped this story on him that blew my mind. And the story was something like this. Imagine a couple is looking to buy a new home and they find two houses and they start comparing them and they look pretty similar. They're both about 2,500 square feet, 3 bedrooms, 2 baths. The difference though, one happens to be $100,000 less than the other. So if all they're going by is price, we got a no-brainer here. So they go with the cheaper house and then they move in, and on the very first day, there's ants all over the place. Not a big deal. They call Orkin, they get an exterminator out there, and they take care of the problem. Well, let's fast forward a few weeks, and all of a sudden it's pouring down rain, and their walls start leaking, and they realize that they just put new shingles on their roof. It's actually a 30-year-old roof that needs to be replaced. Okay, well, at least they saved $100,000, right? Well, let's fast forward a few months, and all of a sudden they're having electric problems, and their lights are flickering. Well, they get an electrician out there and he's telling them that their wiring's not up to code and they gotta rewire the entire house. Oh, and by the way, this couple, they have a 5-year-old that's about to go to kindergarten, and they just learned that he's not going to the school district with all his friends from preschool. And all of a sudden, this couple, they start realizing why that house cost $100,000 less than the other house. And I'm telling you, when he told this story, I was just blown away, and so was the customer. And literally within 15 seconds, they took the contract and they docu-signed that bad boy. And that's the power of storytelling. In fact, I heard this story like 10, 15 years ago, and I still tell it to this day. That's how strong it was. And what's crazy is he didn't say anything bad about the competitor. He didn't say anything about the features, and he didn't compromise on price because he had a really good story. But if you want to be a really good storyteller, you gotta practice. And that's where our next must-have skill is gonna come into play, which is you gotta be a good writer. Who's ever had an email just get completely ignored? If you said you've never had that happen, you're full of shit, or you're literally the best salesperson in the entire world. Because one well-written email, it could be the difference between winning and losing business. And here's the deal, we're all getting bombarded by emails every single day. And so a well-crafted message, it's a make or break for your opportunities. And what a well-written email could do is it can actually build credibility with your customer and persuade them to take action. Conversely, if you write a really crappy email, it could close the doors and they might want nothing to do with you. And I know y'all have done this, because I have too, but you gotta do better than just checking in, because it doesn't offer any insight, it doesn't add any value, and honestly, it's pretty self-serving. So my advice is when you write an email, put some thought into it, offer some insight, share some use cases with them, provide a solution to the problems that they might have mentioned when you were on the call with them, and then make sure to make it clear and concise. I love to use bullet points or numbered lists so they can just quickly scan through your email. And here's the thing, dude, don't use all these complex, robust words and a bunch of acronyms and a bunch of jargon, because you're not trying to impress them with how big your vocabulary is. In fact, there's this saying that says brevity is the sign of wit. So So a lot of times a well-written email, less is actually more, but there's an art to doing less. And my advice to you is when you write your email, read it over, go take a quick break, come back, ask for advice, ask your manager what they think about it. But if it's a doozy to read, try to say it in the least amount of words possible so that you can offer the highest amount of value with the least amount of effort required on your customer side. And what's crazy about emails, I was just talking to my friend about this, every single six-figure deal I'd ever closed, it all started with a banger email post-discovery call. And so I highly suggest you hone in on this skill, and trust me, man, I barely passed my English classes. I never considered myself as a writer, but it's a skill that you can develop and that you must develop if you want to be a top tier AE. But once you hook them in with that email, it's going to come down to our next must-have skill, which is you gotta be a good presenter. Who remembers having to do presentations in school? Were you the type of person who was nervous? Were you shy? Were you unprepared and just winging it? Or were you that person that just shined in the spotlight? And I like to think about presenting as a performance for your sales pitch. And the funny thing about presentation is a lot of people think that you're just born with the skills. But what most people don't realize is that those naturals at presenting are the ones who practice the most. And like I said earlier, you gotta be a good writer, but if you're not preparing, you're not writing down your script, you're not going through it before you get in front of a customer and you're practicing in front of your customer, the chances are you probably suck at presenting. And I'm sure you think, oh, I'm good at winging it, I'm good on the fly. Yeah, I'm sure you are, but I can guarantee if you just practice a little bit more, you'd be that much better. And as I've said before, I've been in SC for a while, so I know the presentation game. And I was a damn good SC. And there's a couple tips here. I mentioned one of them earlier. You gotta be a good storyteller. You also gotta be a good writer, but you gotta be really intentional with your visuals. A lot of people present these complex, noisy slides, and they got all this text on them, and the customers are just reading the slides. Even worse, some salespeople, they just read the slides to their customer. You just send the slide to them, bro. Like, you don't need to actually do a presentation if all you're gonna do is read off the slide deck. No, you need to have visuals that represent what you're saying, kind of pique their interest, but don't tell them the whole story with the visual. Speak to the visual. And if you're gonna be showing your product or application, don't just show them this feature, that feature, that feature, that feature, that feature. No, you're gonna lose them. Everybody's gonna be falling asleep on the other end, and they're gonna be drinking a bunch of coffee just to keep their eyes open. No, what you should do is anytime you talk about a feature or a function, it always has to relate back to the customer. Okay, the nice thing about this feature is it's gonna help you get XYZ result that we had talked about earlier. And I like to think about presenting as a dance. I know when I make this move, that this is gonna be their reaction. And when you get really good at it, you know the highs and lows of your presentation. And what I suggest to you is those moments where you have your typical lulls in your conversation, interject open-ended questions. And don't do this because I hear so many salespeople say this. They present a bunch of slides and they ask the customer, do you have any questions? That's one of the worst questions you can ask, period. Because 9 times out of 10, the customer just says, no, I don't have any questions. And then you just carry on with your boring ass presentation. No, again, they gotta be open-ended. They gotta hook them in and try to make them relevant to something you talked about earlier. And I'm telling you right now, once you get really good at presenting, your customers, they're gonna be eating out the palm of your hand. And that's where our next must-have skill comes in, is you gotta be good at closing. Actually, give me 1 second here. I'm gonna take a quick sip of coffee. Because coffee is for closers. And if you're not closing business, you better not be drinking coffee. But in all seriousness, I don't care if you drink coffee or not. It's just a quote from one of my favorite sales movies, Glengarry Glen Ross. But did you know that 60% of customers say no 4 times before they say yes? And that underscores the importance of persistence in closing in sales. And I remember this one time, I had been working this deal for months. And I got to the final stages. I forecasted this. My quota was banking on this deal, and it fell through at the last minute. And it wasn't until later that I realized I had skipped past so many steps. And that's the problem, is a lot of us get happy years and we have wishful thinking. We hope we win a deal, but there's a big difference between hoping you're gonna win a deal and knowing you're gonna win a deal. And I used to do some crazy stuff, especially when I wasn't talking to the decision maker or the person who signed the contract. I remember this one time I had a guy and I had asked him the question, all right, well, if this was your decision, would you sign the contract today? And he said, yeah, absolutely. I said, okay, cool. So what's your pitch to your boss? And he gave me his pitch. It was pretty weak, honestly. And I straight told him, that wasn't that good. And the dude got pissed at me. He's like, what do you mean it wasn't that good? Like, what do you want me to say? Do you want me to say that if I buy your product, it's gonna bring all this value and have this kind of impact and do this and that? I was like, yeah, man, that's a way better pitch. So anyways, we walk away from the call. He talks to his boss, he gives him the killer pitch, and we get the deal signed. But that's not the best part about the story. Fast forward about a month, and I get a call from this guy. And he says, hey, I just talked to our partner business, and they want to do the exact same contract. I pitched it up to them. And so what happened was, this guy got so fired up, this guy understood the value so deeply, that even though I never talked to this company, even though I never worked with the person signing the contract, I had a champion on my side that actually helped me close the deal. And when you got your customers selling on your behalf when you're not there, you probably did a good job closing the deal. But if you're twisting their arm and you're begging them to sign a contract before the quarter end because you need to hit that quota, chances are they're just gonna ghost you. But it also comes down to our next must-have skill, and that's negotiation. You don't get what you deserve, you get what you negotiate. And so think about negotiations as a game of chess, and every single move counts. Now, if you're playing a game of checkers, then all you're gonna do is talk about price. But negotiation isn't just about price, it's about value. And in tech sales, where contracts are super complex, they could be multi-year, there's implementation services involved, all these different line items, your ability to negotiate, it could significantly impact your deal. And the key is you gotta find win-win situations. And if you're a good communicator and you're a good listener, you understand where to poke your customer, what they really care about. And even though they might be saying that they want a lower price, it might not be exactly what they mean. And so you gotta be creative when it comes to negotiation. I remember this one time I had this guy and he was just griping about this line item on my proposal, and it was for support. He just adamantly didn't want to pay for support. And I had already been giving this guy a good discount. So instead of discounting the whole entire quote, what I was able to get approved, and it's funny that this worked, was I waived support, I zeroed it out, and I just moved it into the base product. So the bottom line price was exactly the same, but for him, he just didn't want to be paying for support. And that's what can happen sometimes with negotiations when you really take the time to understand what your client's concerns are. In negotiation, it's not about pinching pennies or having an ego and being a jerk. No, it's truly about creating win-win situations. You guys are on the same team. I'm trying to help you out here. And sometimes the best negotiation strategy, it's to walk away. Because if you just can't find that win-win situation, sometimes I just let the customer know, hey, unfortunately, I'm not gonna be able to accommodate that. It seems that we're at an impasse right now, and if this is a must-have, then I don't know if we should be doing business together. And that could end one or two ways. Sometimes that's the end of the deal, and that's okay. I'm not desperate. Other times, you call their bluff. And the reality is they said that it had to be this way, but they were just negotiating with you. So just make sure that you understand what the circumstances are, be willing to walk away, and realize that you're still gonna miss shots, no matter how good you are. Because even Michael Jordan, the GOAT of basketball, he missed 43% of his shots. And that's why you gotta have this next must-have skill that any salesperson worth their salt has, and that is you gotta be resilient. And the chances are you're gonna lose more deals than you win. And that's what's messed up about sales, is you're just constantly getting rejected. And that's the reason why it's such a high paying profession, because most people, they don't got the spine to handle that level of rejection. And that's what separates the top tier AEs from the average Joe Schmo that get out of the game. And this all comes back to some fundamental skills you probably learned in Pee Wee football. But whenever you fail, don't be a little crybaby and be like, oh, I can't believe I lost the deal. I tried so hard and I did this. No one feels sorry for you, man. Unless you're hitting your quota, you might get put on a performance plan, because that's how sales works. And resilience, it's a requirement. And so stop looking at your losses as a defeat and start looking at it as a learning opportunity. And this is all coming from somebody who's been rejected more times than you can imagine. I'm talking tens of thousands of times. I remember my first sales job, I was an insurance agent, and I had some peers, they were making 10, 20 calls and they were able to set leads. And I just don't know how they did it, because I had to make hundreds of calls to get a lead. But what ended up happening was I had gotten rejected so many times that I started learning the nuances. And eventually I got to their status. And it wasn't until then that I realized, oh, the only reason these guys are so good is they went through this exact process. I just wasn't there to see it. And before you go thinking that there's just naturals at sales and some people have the gift the gab and some people just got it, they were born with it, that's all bullshit. Because the reality is every top tier salesperson, they got there through practice. They got there through rejection. And if you want to get good at anything, you can't just rely on your natural abilities. You got to be a constant learner. And this actually brings us to our next must-have skill, and that is the fact that you have to be incredibly adaptable, because tech is a fast-moving industry, and the only constant in tech sales is that there's gonna be change. And I've been in this game for 2 decades. The stuff that I was doing back 20 years ago is dramatically different than what I'm doing today. In fact, I didn't even have a CRM. I was tracking people on physical paper back when I started. I remember having to literally pick up a phone. Now we got voice over IP. You just type in a number in the computer. You got dialers working on your behalf. You got automated emails. But if you're not learning these new systems and you're just constantly battling change, the chances are you're gonna fall behind. And if there's anything I learned about sales, it's gonna kick you in the nuts, it's gonna poke you in the eyes, and it's gonna hit you with a sucker punch when you least expect it. And that's why adaptability is so critical. There's so many things out of your control, whether it's your product, whether it's your customer support, or maybe an economic downturn. There's so many factors that can make or break you. And if you're not willing to change, you're probably not gonna survive very long. And I'm not pointing fingers at you, because I've been this guy before. I remember my company, we were selling the same product forever, and all of a sudden we acquired another company and we started selling this more complex software. And I just didn't want to learn it. It was a lot of work. I'm just trying to sell what I've been selling for the last few years. Well, fast forward a couple years and all of a sudden that complex product became one of our flagships. And now I still had to learn it, but I had to learn it while I was running. Versus had I been a little bit more adaptable sooner on, I could have honed in on my skills at a time where I didn't have as much pressure to sell that product. And that was a time in my life where I had wished I'd been a little bit more adaptable. So let me tell you a story about this company named Blockbuster, who wasn't willing to adapt. They were actually one of the fastest growing companies, and I used to go to Blockbuster every single week. It was one of my favorite places. I actually had a membership to it. What ended up happening with Blockbuster was this company that you might have heard of called Netflix came along. And the difference between Blockbuster and Netflix initially was Blockbuster, you had to go into the physical store. With Netflix, you actually got these physical CDs, but they shipped them to your house. And then when you were done watching your movie, you would ship it back. So you would only have to go to your mailbox to get a movie versus having to go to the store. Well, eventually what ended up happening with Netflix, as you know it today, is they started creating a more digital product and started streaming their shows. And all of a sudden, you didn't even need to get off the couch. Well, Blockbuster decided, we're just gonna keep doing things the old-fashioned way. Well, what ended up happening, as most of you might know, is by the time Blockbuster tried to adapt, it was already too late. And Netflix became the king of the entertainment industry. So in other words, don't be Blockbuster. Don't fall behind, because sometimes if you fall too far behind, it's gonna be nearly impossible to catch up. But that also doesn't mean you just take on every little thing and learn all this stuff and start trying to do 50 different things at once, because it does come down to our last must-have skill, and that is time management. Well, they say time is money, and it is your most valuable asset. So the question is, are you making every minute count? Because in tech sales, especially as an account executive, you're juggling so many tasks. You're dealing with client calls, you're having to do forecasts, you're taking on projects, and you're trying to learn new software while you're at it. And there comes a point where you gotta prioritize. In fact, this is such a big topic that we're making an entire video about time management. I suggest you guys check it out. But it's not just about working harder, it's about working smarter. So one tip that I have for time management is start off by just writing everything that you need to do or intend to do for the day. And then I like to draw a little graph on the y-axis, the vertical axis. I put impact. How high of an impact is this task gonna have on my outcome? And then on the x-axis, I put in effort. What level of effort is this gonna take? And you're gonna have a quadrant. And basically what you'll find is you're gonna have some high effort tasks that are also high value tasks. Those are good, but you're also gonna have some high effort tasks that are gonna be low value. Stop doing those. What you really wanna spend your time though, is if you can have a high value task with low effort. That's where the magic is. So the way the quadrants work is you wanna knock out the low effort, high value task first. That's the top priority. Second, you wanna do the high impact, high effort. And then lastly, you might do the low impact, low effort, and you literally shouldn't be doing anything in the high effort, low impact box. So that's a super easy tip. But like I said, we got a whole video dedicated to this where we're actually gonna teach you how you can get twice the amount of work done in half the amount of time. And there you go. Those are the top 10 must-have skills for every account executive in tech sales. How'd you score? If you did anything better than a 7 out of 10, you're not just surviving, you're thriving. But imagine if you mastered all 10 of these skills, I can guarantee you'd be in the top 1%. And if you found this video valuable, you want to keep getting information and tips and secrets on how to smash your quota, make more money, and get promoted, then click that like button.